Hi everyone, welcome to the last lecture. You made it. Good job. All right, so we're talking about conservation, ecosystems, and communities in this last lecture. And that, of course, covers um, global warming. And I want to let you know about this Nature article that came out, and this is actually in 2018, where they were going to do the first sun dimming experiment to test a way to cool the Earth. Since we can't seem to get it together as a global community to stop global warming, there is a group of scientists sort of looking at a plan B. Can we reflect the sun's rays away from the earth? So let's just take a look at what that looks like and what that is. And so this is called geoengineering, and it's a global intervention, and as I said, sort of a plan B when things sort of get out of hand with the warming of the earth. Is there something else that can be done? And so here's what they've come up with. So one way to cool the planet quickly would be to make the sky block more sunlight. But predicting these knock-on effects, both positive and negative, remains a challenge. Like, what else are we going to cause by doing that is not anticipated? So what they want to do is ultimately, if this works, is to have these high-flying planes that can release small particles into the stratosphere to reflect oncoming rays. And one estimate says that this could reduce global temperatures by roughly 1.5 degrees centigrade for less than 10 billion US dollars a year. And so researchers aim to release calcium carbonate into the stratosphere. This was, as I said, back in 2018, and they wanted to do it next year, which would have been 2019, to test some aspects of this solar geoengineering. Now, it didn't happen. They didn't do it. We'll get to that in a bit. And so their thought process is, by releasing the calcium carbonate into the atmosphere, that it's going to reflect some of the solar rays, thereby decreasing the temperature and cooling. So these dimming skies that would result could shift global precipitation, which is rain, rain patterns, pulling water resources from some area. So you're going to see, as we learn where rain actually comes from, why it rains, that if you cause it to rain in one area, then you may be causing, drying and desertification in another. So these cooler temperatures and more scattered light could promote the growth of forests and other ecosystems, basically locking away more atmospheric carbon, which is what we want to do, right? Decrease the carbon load that's in the atmosphere that's acting like a blanket trapping heat. So the problem is, and that would be a good thing, right? But the problem is, again, when you're causing sunlight scattering, and rain to happen in one area, you're affecting another area. And so, the benefit is crops could definitely benefit from reduced heat stress, but these lower levels of direct sunlight could also hamper growth. We don't know, how much sunlight is actually going to be blocked, right? That's why they want to do these small test experiments to find out how much blocking could actually happen, how much rainfall would occur, what are the potential adverse effects. But the issue that we have is that without action on these greenhouse gases that are causing a heat sink on the Earth, then the oceans could continue to absorb carbon dioxide and grow more and more acidic, which basically is going to kill off, of course, the fish and the other animals in the ocean. But we get most of our oxygen from the ocean. So for every 2 breaths we take, one of those actually comes from the phytoplankton, those plankton that photosynthesize in the ocean. And so we kill those off, we've got a really big problem. So that's why this ocean acidification is so concerning due to global warming. So the plot thickens. Of course, I told you that that article was back in 2018. They were supposed to do the test in 2019, the small test. That didn't happen. And then, of course, in 2020, as we know, all scientific research, the great majority of it, switched over to trying to solve COVID-19. And so there was an update that was given in January 2020. This came out in the journal Science, where U.S. geoengineering research got a lift with $4 million from Congress. So once everything sort of gets back to normal, after COVID-19, then the world will begin again to shift to, trying to solve global warming. So keep your eyes on that. Let's see what happens and determine how you feel about geoengineering. All right, so let's get to ecosystems and communities. So we live on a really beautiful planet. It's absolutely gorgeous. When we look at nature and how it functions, it all gets down to different ecosystems and communities. And ecosystems are found not just in obvious places like ponds and tropical rainforests, but in some really unexpected places. Like you could have a full ecosystem happening on the back of a beetle. So all ecosystems share 2 essential features. Number one, you have the biotic environment, and this is the living organisms within an area, often referred to as the community. And then you have the physical or abiotic environment. And these are the chemical resources and physical conditions within an area, often referred to as the organism's habitat. And so we have this term called biomes, and biomes are large ecosystems that cover huge geographic areas. And there's 9 chief terrestrial biomes that are determined by the temperature and the amounts of precipitation in conjunction with the magnitude of seasonal variation in these factors. So let's take a look at what these biomes are. We have the tropical forest, we have the desert, we have the savanna, the temperate grassland, the temperate deciduous forest, the chaparral, which we have here in the Los Angeles mountains, coniferous forests, the tundra, and polar ice. But there's also aquatic biomes. And so aquatic biomes are determined by physical features, including salinity, water movement, and depth. So we've got lakes and ponds, rivers and streams. We have estuaries and wetlands. We have open oceans and coral reefs. And as we can see, weather is a huge factor. And so let's take a look at the distribution of solar energy. So if you've ever wondered why the equator is so much warmer than the North Pole or even the South Pole, this illustration basically explains really nicely why. So the sun shines most directly on the Earth's equator, where the solar energy is spread out over a smaller area than the same amount of energy hitting the poles. We can see that this is a much larger range, and then we have this concentrated amount of energy at the equator. And so this leads to warmer temperatures at the equator. So closer to the poles, the curvature of the Earth is actually causing sunlight to be spread out over a larger area, thereby reducing its heating effect in any one spot, which is why both the North Pole and the South Pole are much colder than the equator. But let's take a look at the formation of rain. We're all very familiar with it. We need it. It's very important for our crops, for us to actually survive. We need fresh water, but let's look at how that happens. So here we have, number one, explaining it in basically 3 steps. Here we have the air being heated. When solar hits the Earth, it warms the air at that point, and the heated air begins to rise. Now the rising air, as you can see in this sort of temperature-based column, as the hot air rises, getting further from the warm Earth, it begins to cool. And cooling air loses moisture. So because cold air holds less moisture than warm air, clouds form, and then eventually rain falls. So that's really important to remember. So as the warm air rises, it cools. Cool air loses moisture. Cool air doesn't want to hold on to moisture, right? And then this is what forms the clouds, and this is what causes the rain to fall. But let's take a look at what forms deserts. Like, why doesn't it rain in the desert, right? Well, we're going to look at it again in 3 steps. So as warm air rises away from the Earth's surface and becomes colder, so just kind of follow these flow patterns, the cold air falls towards the Earth's surface and becomes warmer once again. And as air moves downward towards Earth's surface and becomes warmer, it holds on to more and more moisture. So in these areas, there is very little rainfall. So let's take a look at the equator, and we can kind of see that happening because it's so much warmer that the air never really gets to a cool temperature to the point that it can release the rain, that it can cause clouds and it can release the rain. And so this is why we start to get deserts in these areas. So just kind of follow these temperature arrows, and you'll see exactly where the deserts are, right, based on these arrows as the air is moving downwards. Okay, so here you can see at the equator, what it's showing you is the cloud cover, right, and the rain that's happening, even though it's very warm. So that's why we get deserts. But there's another reason. So we can have things called these rain shadows. So here we're looking at a overhead image of the Earth. We've got the ocean here. We've got this mountain range, if you follow my cursor here. And then we've got this rain shadow desert. This is looking at the Andes Mountains near the west coast of South America. And what's happening is causing what's called a rain shadow effect. And what is that? Let's look closer at that. So when wind blows from the ocean towards the land, it starts rising as it hits the mountains. And we know that rising air cools and holds less moisture, leading to cloud formation and rain. So we get the rain here on this side of the mountain as the air is rising and cooling. Well, now all the rain, the moisture is released, right? So as the air moves over the top of the mountain range and comes down the other side, it's becoming warmer and increasing the moisture that it can hold, thereby reducing rainfall and resulting in these dry areas. So we end up losing our moisture on this side of the mountain, leaving this side of the mountain where it comes down and becomes warm, dry. And that we call a desert. But the thing is, we can actually influence the weather. And we do this inadvertently, but when we build these very tall buildings, when we take asphalt, cement, concrete, and we cover over the natural ground, then the asphalt, cement, and building tops begin to absorb heat, thereby raising the temperature, as you can see looking at this temperature gradient here. And suddenly we're heating up the ground, right? Where it would have been cooler had that just been soil, right? And then these tall buildings that we build, they create their own weather effects. They actually force wind downward. So you can get these changes in weather based on our building patterns. So let's talk a little bit about the ocean and the ocean circulation patterns. So there are several large circulation patterns of flowing water in the oceans due to a combination of forces, including wind, the Earth's rotation, the gravitational pull of the moon, temperature, and salt concentration. And so you can see these flow patterns that are happening here, right? And in the reddish color, these are the warm ocean currents. And then in this bluish color, we have the cold ocean currents. So you can see where the flow is going. So we can see that beaches on the east coast of the United States actually have warmer water than the west coast beaches at the same latitude, which is really interesting because we tend to think of the water in, say, California being warmer and then the water, over here in the Atlantic side, but the waters here are actually pretty cold. But this also explains, when you take a look at these flow patterns, why you've got such nice warm water in the Caribbean, which is right here in this region, etc. Okay? But these ocean currents also are causing weather effects, right? So that we have something called El Nino, and El Nino happens every 2 to 7 years, and it's blamed for flooding, droughts, famine, and a variety of other extreme climate disruption. So let's kind of compare and contrast what happens during normal conditions and what happens during El Nino conditions. So we'll just start with step one. So in usual conditions, you have these steady winds blowing westward across the Pacific Ocean from South America towards Southeast Asia. So just kind of follow the arrows here. But in El Nino conditions, the usual South America to Southeast Asia winds ease up just a bit. Now, in normal conditions, these winds push warm surface water away from the coast of South America, heating the air above it, which causes the air to rise and produce these tropical rainstorms. Now, in El Nino conditions, without the push of the wind, the warm water flows back towards South America. The cooled water around Australia and the Philippines cools the air and causes dry weather that can lead to droughts. Now, in normal conditions, and you can also take a look at the sea levels here and compare and contrast them, okay, in normal and El Nino conditions. Now, off the coast of South America, in normal conditions, colder water is going to upwell from the ocean depths, and the cold water cools the air above it, causing extremely dry weather. But in El Nino conditions, without the warm surface water being blown west, colder water from the ocean depths cannot upwell, and then the warm surface water begins to warm the air, resulting in rainfall. Now, water from the depths of the ocean brings up rich nutrients, enabling plankton to flourish and feed the huge populations of fish. And we can see that kind of happening here as the cold water moves upwards. Well, with no upwelling of cold water and nutrients, then plankton levels drop dramatically and fish stocks are wiped out, so fish begin to die. So we can see that changes during an El Nino event can start this chain reaction of unusual weather all around the globe, causing increased rainfall in the U.S., the Midwest, storms in Central in coastal California, and warm weather in South Africa and Japan. This is really cool. This is a chameleon actually eating a locust, a grasshopper. And that takes us into energy flow within an ecosystem. All right, so we know that energy from the sun is intercepted and converted into chemical energy, which passes through an ecosystem in about 4 stops. So you've got your primary producers. Here, just kind of follow the chain here, starting with the sun. You have your primary producers, which are plants that convert light energy from the sun into food through photosynthesis. And then these plants are eaten by the herbivores, the primary consumers, and these are animals that eat plants. And then we have the secondary consumers. These are the carnivores. These are animals that eat the herbivores. And then we have the tertiary consumers. These are the top carnivores, and these are animals that eat other carnivores, eat other animals. And so the food chain is this is actually this simplified pathway. Usually the way it's kind of portrayed, but in actuality, it's more of a food web. And food webs are often a better representation because many organisms can occupy more than one position in the chain, right? So we can see here, if you just take a look at this hawk, that we have the hawk that actually, can eat the snake. It can eat the herbivore. Here, it's eating another herbivore. Here we've got the grasshopper, which eats the plant, also being eaten by an herbivore, which normally eats the plants, but also can eat the grasshopper. So you can see it's all sort of this interconnected web. And then we have these little guys, which are Earth's recyclers. So when they die, organisms at every level in the food chain, and this is including us, provide sustenance for decomposers in organisms called detritivores. And these are important chemical recyclers. They're recycling components through the food chain. And so here, one that you're very, very familiar with is mold. Mold here is actually decomposing this orange. Here we've got this dung beetle, a detrivore, and a detrivore, as you can see here in the definition, is an animal which feeds on dead organic material, especially plant detritus. So here we've got this dung beetle, a detrivore, which is feeding on the decomposing matter. They stand on their head and they use their back legs to roll up a ball of dung, a ball of waste, and basically that's what they feed upon, and they decompose it. And they're really, really important because decomposers and detrivores break down organic waste, releasing the chemical components that can then be reused by plants and other producers. So it's this really large, beautiful cycle. Now, let's look at the different cycles that we have. We've got the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle as the most important. And let's look at the carbon cycle to begin with. So for terrestrial organisms, organisms that are walking on the surface of the earth, the most important carbon reservoir is actually in the atmosphere. This is atmospheric carbon dioxide, right? Normally it's a good thing, right? Because plants use carbon molecules from the atmospheric carbon dioxide and the light energy from the sun to build sugars through photosynthesis. So they need CO2 and they need the sun. Now, carbon moves through the food chain as organisms eat the plants and are themselves eaten. So now we're going to follow the carbon, right? So the plant took in the CO2. And then you have the herbivores eating the plants. Now, organisms extract energy from the carbon bonds and exhale carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere as a byproduct. So you can see the cycle kind of feeding back into the atmosphere as we exhale CO2, which the plants need to take up. But when you have large numbers of organisms die, then carbon can accumulate in the ground. So now we have the death of these organisms because eventually they do die. They go into the ground. And over time, the organic remains can be transformed by bacteria in the soil into coal, oil, and natural gas, which we have learned to extract and use. Now, here's where the problem lies. By burning coal, oil, and natural gas, we're releasing these large amounts of carbon stores back into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. And now there is much more carbon dioxide that should be in the atmosphere. It should be locked down here in the earth, right? And we're pulling it out and releasing it back, basically disturbing the cycle. And this is what's causing the blanketing of the heat of the earth, the warming of the oceans, causing the acidification of the oceans, etc. Now let's look at the nitrogen cycle. So we talked about nitrogen. You learned about how important it is for plants. Here we have atmospheric nitrogen, N2. For nitrogen, the most important reservoir is again in the atmosphere. And so nitrogen gas, which has a chemical structure completely unusable by most organisms, is actually fixed by soil-dwelling bacteria, which produce ammonia and other compounds containing nitrogen, which the plants can use. So let's just follow the cycle here. We have atmospheric nitrogen going down to these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and now, because of their work, the plants can actually uptake the nitrogen. So the nitrogen compounds are further modified by other bacteria into a form that can be taken up by the plants and used to build proteins. Now, nitrogen moves through the food chain as organisms eat plants and are themselves eaten, right? And nitrogen is used by each organism to build new proteins along the way, because we need nitrogen to make our proteins, right? And then again, animals die, everything dies, and these animal wastes and dead animals and plants are broken down by the soil bacteria that convert the nitrogen in tissue back into nitrogen gas. And then the nitrogen gas then returns to the atmosphere and the cycle starts again, okay? And we have to remember that nitrogen is necessary to build all amino acids, and amino acids are the base compounds of every protein molecule, okay? But this is where our nitrogen actually comes from. It comes from atmospheric nitrogen, which actually is broken down by these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, so it can be taken up by the plants and eaten by the animals, including us, of which animals, including us, die. We return to the soil, again broken down by a bacteria, where the nitrogen is released again in a gas form, and it returns back to the atmosphere, and the cycle continues, okay? And let's look at the phosphorus cycle. Remember ATP? The P being phosphorus. Let's see where that phosphorus comes from, right? So here, looking at the phosphorus cycle, so plants absorb phosphorus through their roots in the form of phosphate. So it all starts with the plant's roots in the soil absorbing the phosphate down here. Just follow my cursor. Now, phosphate moves through the food chain as organisms eat the plants and are themselves eaten. And then phosphate is used by each organism to produce ATP and to build DNA, right? But then when animals and organisms and ourselves, we die, we return to the soil where we're broken down by bacteria and other decomposers, and that's releasing the phosphorus again. And so additional phosphorus is gradually released into the soil again, and we come down to phosphorus being in the soil. But there's another step. We've got some phosphorus that's in the rock, right? So here we can see a cloud, we can see rain, we can see the mountains and the rocks here, and additional phosphorus is coming down to be released into the soil as rock is slowly weathered. So we've got two inputs into the soil for the phosphorus, from the rock being weathered and also from the decomposition of animals and this phosphorus is taken up by the plant's roots. And so that is the phosphorus cycle. And so you would think, okay, well, then if we needed more plants in the Earth's ecosystem in order to stem global warming, then wouldn't it just be beneficial to flood the ecosystem with all of these nutrients? Why don't we just flood it with a bunch of phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon, right? Well, it turns out when you do that, it's a bad thing, and it has a name, and it's eutrophication. So this is the increase in nutrients in an ecosystem, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, which often leads to the rapid growth of algae and bacteria in aquatic systems. And these organisms then consume much of the oxygen, leading to large die-offs of animals. So when you have this runoff, and usually the runoff is coming from fertilizers, from agriculture, and that's usually where the damage is coming from. So the farmers that are heavily fertilizing their fields, and then you've got the runoff due to the water and the irrigation going into the nearby, streams, going to the rivers, going to the ocean, etc. You're getting this algae bloom, which is consuming all the oxygen, and then all of the fish and the animals die. And so you cannot have this sudden increase in nutrients in a system. It all has to be balanced, right? Remember homeostasis in physiology? Well, the ecosystem in the earth has its own form of homeostasis. There has to be balance, right? Right. This is one of my favorite little guys. Just super, super cute. Living among the sea anemone in the ocean. This little guy right here. Remember from the movie Finding Nemo? Okay, little clownfish. Let's talk about niches, because that little sea anemone is in his perfect niche. So it turns out, this clownfish. It turns out these sea anemones, what they do is they sting other fish, and that's how they actually capture their food, right? So they have these little poisonous stingers. But this little guy is very well adapted to live amongst all of their little stingers, so he gets protection from predators. He kind of fools other fish into thinking they too can swim amongst the tentacles of the sea anemone, of which case they get entrapped and then they get eaten. But he is living in his perfect niche. So what is a niche? So a niche has features, and the features are, a niche is the space that an organism requires. It is the type and amount of food an organism utilizes. It is the timing of an organism's reproduction. It's an organism's temperature and moisture requirements and other necessary living conditions. And it is the organisms for which it is a food source, right? And a niche, also going through niche features, has an influence on competitors. All right, so there's two ways to think about a niche. You have a realized niche, and then you have a fundamental niche. So an organism's fundamental niche is the full range of conditions under which it may live. This huge possibility of conditions which it could survive and it could live, right? But in actuality, this may be smaller than its realized niche due to competition and other factors. So yes, it can live in all these different areas, but it doesn't because of competition on all of these other areas. So for example, urban areas actually reduce suitable habitat within the geographic range of a bald eagle. Likewise, interference from other species can limit access to habitat within its geographic range. So here we can see this is the range of the bald eagle. This is its fundamental niche, right? However, its realized niche is there's not any bald eagles, living in the city of Los Angeles. Why? Because we're here and we make it a hostile environment for them. So their realized niche is actually much smaller. All right, so hopefully that makes just logical sense, right? Now that you kind of understand the terms. And so when we look back again at these niche features, we can understand that it is the space that an organism requires. It is the type and amount of food that an organism utilizes, and it's the timing of the organism's reproduction. It is the organism's temperature and moisture requirements and other necessary living conditions. And it also includes the organisms for which it is a food source, right? And the niche also has the feature of the influence on competitors, right? All right. So here we have this lovely little moth that is very well adapted with a super long tongue to actually obtain the nectar of this flower. And that takes us to talking about niches and what happens when niches overlap, right? When a niche of one organism overlaps with the niche of another. Let's take a closer look at that. So let's look at it in terms of these two organisms. So when grown alone under a particular set of environmental conditions, each of these two very similar Paramecium species will thrive. So let's just say Paramecium purple and Paramecium green. These are not real names. I'm just giving them the names based on the color coding of the illustration. But two separate Paramecium species, when they live alone, they completely thrive. But when both species are actually grown together, because now their niches are overlapping, the species begin to compete. And there are two outcomes possible. One, you can get competitive exclusion, where one species within the niche utilizes the resources more efficiently and drives the other species to local extinction, right? And so here we see that our green colored Paramecium wins, and it competed the purple Paramecium. So competitive exclusion. The other one was excluded. Or you can get what's called resource partitioning, where each species actually begins to alter its use of the niche, basically dividing the resources. So the resources that are here near the bottom of the test tube, this Paramecium species basically alters and adapts to use exclusively that. And the resources that are here in the upper region of the test tube, then this Paramecium species alters and adapts to use exclusively that. And so they each basically partition the resources and stay in their lane, right? And then they both get to live, okay? So when the fundamental niches of two species overlap, competition occurs. And so you can have what's called competition and character displacement. So character displacement occurs when natural selection reduces the competition between two species by producing an evolutionary divergence in one or both of the species. So here we have two finches that both start out with medium-sized beaks when they live on two separate islands, okay? Both medium-sized beaks. Now, when the birds begin to inhabit the same island, then they suddenly are competing for the same resources. And then we can see this evolutionary shift in the beak size in each species that can occur. And this is a change called character displacement. So it has a term. Character displacement is an evolutionary adaptation that makes resource partitioning possible. So we can see that we have a change in the beak so that this one's eating a smaller seed, and then this one is actually eating just the larger seed. When at the beginning, when they were living on two separate islands, they could eat both seeds, right? But then we had this evolutionary shift called character displacement. Now, let's talk more about a niche and an organism's response. So we have physical defenses for reducing predation from predators, right? So Physical defenses, we can have things like mechanical defenses, such as the quills of the Cape porcupine, can help to protect an organism from a predator, from predation. So that's a physical defense. We also have chemical defenses, such as toxins, such as those found within the strawberry poison dart frog, which can make an organism basically, because he's making this toxin, it makes him poisonous, or it may not kill the predator that's trying to eat it. It may just make it unpalatable, where whatever wants to eat it goes to bite it, and it's just so bitter that it just foams at the mouth, drops it, and carries on. But these guys are actually very, very poisonous. They actually make poisonous darts with them. They take the indigenous people will take their arrow tips and then basically capture one of these frogs, run their arrow tip over the frog so that it feels it's in danger, it submits, it releases its toxin in the form of this mucus on its back, and then they smear that onto the arrow, and then they go hunting, and they're able to drop a very large animal from a tree using that arrow. So those are poisonous dart frogs. So that's a form of a chemical defense against predators. But there's also just warning coloration. So organisms that produce toxic chemicals, such as the monarch butterfly, they frequently have these bright color patterns, and basically it's a warning to potential predators to stay away. And you can see, here the dart frog basically is doing the same thing. It also is doing a coloration warning as well, very brightly colored, right? So warning coloration. And then we have camouflage. This is cryptic coloration, such as that seen in the praying mantis, which can enable an organism to blend into its surroundings, doing two things. It helps it avoid predators, but also it helps it to be a better predator itself, because it's really difficult for its prey to see it, and it's also difficult for its own predator to spot it. Then we have what's called behavioral defenses. We see this with schooling fish, right? So this is hiding or escaping. And some prey species excel at hiding or running or both, effectively avoiding predation. Just think of a rabbit. They can take off pretty fast to get away from whatever wants to eat it, because many carnivores like to eat rabbits. Right? Same thing with small fish. So a variation of this strategy comes from safety in numbers. So many species, including these schooling fish, will travel in these large groups to reduce their predation risk, because as they move as a school, it becomes more difficult for a predator to just hone in on one when the whole thing is moving, and thereby allowing the individual to live. Then there's behavioral defenses that reduce predation, so fighting back. So some prey species actually fight back against their attacker, effectively avoiding predation. For example, this is the fulmar. It's a seabird, and it defends its nest from attacks with projectile vomiting at the intruder, which is gross and disgusting, and the predators tend to leave it alone. But then, this is really interesting. We have here the anglerfish, and this fish actually has this structure here. You can see where my cursor is, that has evolved to trick prey organisms into coming right to the predator where they're eating. So they're basically sort of fishing for their dinner, right? So an evolutionary change. Let's talk a little bit about parasites. Parasites are predators that benefit from a symbiotic relationship with their host. So there are ectoparasites, such as bed bugs that you can see here. And an ectoparasite basically lives on the outside, ecto outside. So they live on their host. They also will live in the bedding, etc. And then we have endoparasites. They live inside. And so here what we're looking at is a trypanosoma, your red blood cells, and this is an endoparasite that invades the human host, and it's the cause of African sleeping sickness. And so they live inside the host. Now, there may be 3 or 4 times as many parasitic species as there are non-parasitic species on the planet, which is pretty mind-blowing, right? But let's look at the ingenuity of parasites, right? How are they living inside a host? How are they getting to the next host if they're living inside a host? Well, let's take a look at rabies. So rabies is more effectively passed from one animal to another by causing the host to basically foam at the mouth and aggressively bite, thereby transmitting rabies. So parasites have surprising ways of solving a challenging problem, how to get from one individual host to another. And so here, rabies actually goes to the brain, causing the infected individual to become extremely aggressive, of which case then the rabies is able to be transmitted through the saliva. It will paralyze the throat muscles of the individual that's infected. That's why they salivate. That's why they foam at the mouth. They can't swallow, right? In addition to their brain being completely deranged and turn towards aggression, so now they're going to bite the next victim and transmit the rabies. Now, this is sort of the classical form of rabies that everyone is very familiar with. When you see an animal like this, you're going to leave it alone, right? However, there is another form of rabies that most people are not familiar with, which is a very dangerous form of rabies, and it's called the dumb form of rabies, because with this, the animal does not appear to be aggressive. They are not foaming at the mouth, but basically they come walking out of the forest and walk straight up to the next individual that this parasite is going to transmit to, and they're going to bite them, right? And then, of course, die of rabies. But this dumb form is one of the most dangerous forms because most people will walk up to the animal that is walking up to them infected with rabies. So if you ever are out in the forest and out comes a skunk walking towards you, don't think that you are tra-la-la, just someone that the skunk loves. It is a high probability that that animal has rabies, and you get close enough, it's going to bite you and transmit rabies. And now you've got a huge problem, and death will be there in about 15 days. So be very careful of wildlife that comes up to you. They should run away from you. And so remember this dumb form of rabies when you're out in the forest, okay? With skunks and bats being the #1 carriers of rabies around the world, but any warm-blooded mammal can carry rabies, right? And it gets lower on the list for different species. And of course, we vaccinate most of our animals that we live in contact with, our dogs, our cats, so that when they go out and they come in contact with other animals that, unbeknownst to us, they're not going to transmit, get rabies and then give it to us, etc., before they die. So that's why those rabies vaccines are very important for your companion pets. All right, enough on rabies. Let's talk about non-negative species interactions. So mutualism. So this is the interaction in which both species benefit. Okay, here we've got the plant and we've got the bee, and they're both benefiting. Mutualism. Then we have commensalism. And this is the interaction in which one species benefits and the other neither benefits nor is harmed. So as we can see, here we've got two species, and the one is benefiting, right? Because as this water buffalo is walking through the weeds, he's actually causing all these different bugs to fly up to get out of his way, and that's where this little bird actually gets to benefit. Well, it's not really benefiting the water buffalo, but it's not hurting him either, right? So that's commensalism. All right. Let's take a look at succession and what that is and what that means. So succession is the change in species composition in a community over time. So let's take a look. So here we have a couple of terms to understand. We've got the colonizing community, we've got the intermediate communities, and then we have what's called the climax communities. So let's take a look at those. So primary succession begins after a disturbance leaves an area barren of soil and with no, quote, life. But you have fungi, bacteria, lichen, and seeds are often amongst the earliest colonizers. So you've got your colonizing community. Now, then you've got your secondary succession. And so secondary succession is like primary succession with a head start. So it begins when a disturbance opens up part of a community to the development and growth of species previously outcompeted by other species in the area. So here we've got mosses beginning to grow and trap moisture, allowing the seeds of other plants to germinate. These are our intermediate communities, and then small herbs arrive, and then shrubs begin to grow, shading out the mosses and the herbs, right? So now we're starting to see a change. We're starting to see a succession. And then these small trees grow and begin to outcompete the shrubs. And then finally, the longer living, larger species outcompete the initial colonizers and persist as a stable and self-sustaining community, right? So disturbance is a fundamental part of most ecosystems and can repeatedly set a community back to an earlier stage of succession. And we see this with fire. Fire is not a bad thing. We don't like it because we tend to build our homes, our niches, our communities, you know, amongst the forest, etc. And when that, you know, goes up in flames, as it needs to do, then our homes burn down. And so we do everything we can to stop it. But what happens is then you get this overgrowth of shrubs and things like that, which again are going to burn. And that's why we have these fires that happen in succession in certain areas, and why they have to be allowed to burn. You can only put it off for so long, right? All right, so disturbance is not a bad thing. It's a fundamental part of most ecosystems. All right, let's talk about keystone species and what those are. And this is going to be our last slide. A keystone species such as the sea star. Let's take a look at the sea star, which is right here. You can see my cursor. A keystone species has an unusually large influence on the presence or absence of numerous other species in the community. So let's take a look. So here we have the community when sea stars are present. So when sea stars basically are here, we can see all this diversity in the community, in the ecosystem, right? However, when sea stars are removed from an intertidal zone, then species diversity decreases drastically, and suddenly only mussels remain. Why? Because mussels begin to eat up everything in the area. And it is the sea stars that were controlling the mussel population. And when you remove them, because they're oh so pretty in the intertidal zone, and you take them out and take them home and dry them out so you can have them on your bookshelf, you've completely destroyed an intertidal zone, right? This is why we don't want to do that. So preserving just one keystone species has the effect of preserving many additional species at the same time. That's why they're called a keystone species. Okay? So, with that very, very important point, we're going to end this lecture. You've got one additional video that's going to be shown down below that hopefully will help you to understand why in science we do measurements, why humans are actually the worst at being a witness of what actually happened. We're going to see why in a really fun way. So I'll see you in the next video in this last week, and see you next time. Bye.